Hello, and welcome to Read the Care Tag, a fashion podcast. If you love anything fashion related and you never grew out of playing dress up, well, then this podcast is for you. With a sprinkle of history, a dabble of pop culture, a healthy dollop of fashion obsession, and a pinch of philosophical questioning, I hope you enjoy the show. This being the very first episode, I feel like I should take it back to the beginning and explain who I am and what this podcast is going to be. My name is Maya, and I have always loved the process of making. Over the years, I've left my parents' basement full of weird clay sculptures, clothing mock-ups, and infinite half-fleshed out ideas. So many of these projects boiled down to making clothes. And in my early hot glue gun girl days, I could not comprehend how clothes could possibly be made before electric sewing machines and no-sew glue. As I dug deeper into the fascinating history of fashion, I fell further and further down the rabbit hole. We can all conjure up images of the opulent Queen Elizabeth I, but imagining the labor it takes to produce those clothes is mind-numbing. Sure, we can say she was the queen, she was rich. Of course she had those things, but she wasn't the only one caring about throwing fits. The styles and trends of the rich trickled down the classes then just as they do today. But in those times, we poor plebes would be spending our hard-earned money and precious time to create these things for ourselves, rather than buying knockoff versions on websites of dubious character. All jokes aside, the more I delved into the story of fashion, the more perspective I gained. Our clothing is steeped in a rich tea that spills the story of our traditions, our personal lives, and the world we live in. Our traditions and our culture have shaped who we are and how we dress from the dawn of humanity. So after this extremely lengthy introduction, let's get right into it. This episode, we'll be diving into my attempt to somewhat, partially, maybe a little bit, answer the question of why we wear clothes, and what shaped how humans choose our clothing throughout history. So if you're listening to this show, I'm going to take a wild guess here, you probably like clothes. And if so, you have likely grappled with many of the same dilemmas I have, such as, why do I like this stuff? Is it shallow that I care so much about what I wear? Why does it matter what I wear to a funeral or a wedding, school, the workplace, a date? Why do we dress the way we dress? Then, of course, comes the lovely existential feeling of waste and horror at the state of, say it with me, fast fashion. Balancing feelings about sustainability and the earth with the art of adorning ourselves is a dilemma that has certainly sent me down a spiral or two or three or four. So then, why? Why do we continue to cover ourselves with pretty things for thousands of years and we literally can't seem to stop? Well, to answer this question, I went on a research journey with my trusty pal, Google Scholar
and Wikipedia.
Shh. I want to emphasize that this will largely be my opinions and interpretations of the research I've done, plus my personal feelings. The sources will be linked in the description. Now, back to the question at hand. Why do we clothe ourselves? The simple answer given in the first paragraphs of pretty much every piece of text follows the line of we wear clothes to protect ourselves from the elements and conserve our body warmth. And while, yes, that is pretty self-evident, it can't be the only reason. If it was, why don't we walk around naked in the summer? And why do we still wear miniskirts out in the winter? Then we have the second most common argument, the modesty argument. We wear clothes because we're ashamed to let our business hang out. However, that doesn't hold up either, as countless anthropological studies find that the shame of certain dress actually stems from tradition rather than specific body parts. In some places, breasts are left uncovered, and in others, not having certain tattooing or paint conveys just as much shame as a nip slip or getting the wind caught in your skirt Marilyn Monroe style. When we take a step away from the basic functions of clothing, the general consensus leads to one key conclusion on why our forefathers began to wear clothing: to convey their status and qualities towards each other, in order to attract mates and structure hierarchy. Certainly the protection from environment functionality was still important, but most of the details on ancient clothes have little to do with function. We see this from early warriors decorating themselves with war trophies, and others dressing themselves with expensive materials in mass quantities to display their wealth. Unless you were in a cold climate, your cloak's function would not be improved by being made of fur rather than tanned leather, or enhanced by a trim of beads. In fact, these things could actually hinder you if it came to a rainy day or sneaking up on game. The occasional reduction in function in favor of form was also not accidental. Wearing countless furs did not help early hunter-gatherers hunt, but it did convey their hunting skills and help them find a partner as well as place them in their group's hierarchy. But just like today, practicality is still a necessity. Different clothes are practical for different situations. The opulent Queen Elizabeth I will have a much more function-based riding habit than her courtwear. Of course, if you're riding a horse, you're going to have different needs from your clothes than you will for sitting and standing in court. Nonetheless, the need for practicality doesn't stop people from adding decoration. Think of modern gorpcore and outdoor fashion. Just because the function of the item is a priority, that doesn't stop brands like Arc'teryx, Columbia, and Solomon from finding ways to add character and personality to the garments. This is something that tracks throughout history. Some of the oldest recorded shoes were found in a cave in Spain, and they closely resemble the modern flip-flop, a shoe which is really the simplest form for its function, just a way to keep it on your foot. But even this prehistoric shoe has signs of embellishment through the use of a different braiding texture around the edge and a variety of weaving techniques, which don't enhance its strength or durability. The findings at this cave are particularly significant because archaeologists also found shoes that were unused and for that reason presumed to be for burial purposes. Unless we're talking about The Walking Dead here, the shoe's intended function will never be needed, which makes the form take priority. The delicate tango between form and function is not the only determinant of what and how clothes are made. Who is going to be wearing them is also extremely important. This leads to, in my opinion, the real purpose of clothing through the ages. Our clothes are meant to reflect who the person wearing them is. Just as prehistoric men communicated they were hunters in their dress, so did nuns, priests, peasants, and aristocrats. And so do we. Today, however, we have a bit more freedom in how we choose to present ourselves. Back during good old antiquity, aka that one unit in 6th grade social studies on ancient Greece and Rome, what you could wear was determined by more than what you did as a job or even how much money you had. Social standing, gender, and age also played a role. Before we get into this seriously ancient history, I'm going to make a quick note. I want to point out that due to the passage of time and the fragility of clothing, the information we have on what people wore during these times is limited to what was written down about these things and the very few extant garments that remain. So I will be basing my information off of my research. However, often records and artifacts from history lean heavily towards the more affluent. So I will do my best to cover these topics broadly, but when it comes to things that aren't exactly concretely proven, some things are conjectures made by fashion historians who I'm opting to go with. Additionally, a personal pet peeve of mine when it comes to history is the mixing of time periods. Think like 1400s, 15th century, mid-Renaissance period. Using all these terms interchangeably can get confusing, so if I am switching terms, I will try my absolute best to always clarify years when I can. Alright, back to antiquity. This period took place around the 8th century BCE to the 5th century CE, and was also known as the Greco-Roman era. Studies of this period largely focused on ancient Greece and Rome, as the name suggests, but other Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures are often a part of, as they were sharing a lot of cultural elements during this time due to lots of interfighting, let's just say. Lots of colonizing each other, to put it mildly. Now, let's dive into ancient Greece, the originator of sumptuary laws. Now, if you've never heard this term before, don't worry, I hadn't either until recently, And in brief, these are laws that basically regulate the consumption, get it, of materials. And this ranges from food to clothing to construction. If you can consume it, it shall be regulated. Although we don't know all the details, as it was quite a long time ago, we do know that Spartans, in that classic Spartan vibe, had laws banning excess and fancy things. For example, they were forbidden to own a house or furniture that was created via more high tech tools than a saw and an axe. Are you kidding me? Like a saw and an axe, this is all you got? Precious metals were also forbidden, so even their currency was made of iron. Spartans, am I right? Then, as we slide over into Rome, we see that classic Romans, they took something unnecessary and made it even more complicated and unnecessary. In 215 BCE, Rome launched a series of laws which had detailed regulation of everything, from how many ounces of gold you can wear to the amount of food you can have at your party. And when I say ounces, I mean half an ounce. Women could wear half an ounce of gold. Weirdly specific, but okay. Some examples of these fun laws are as follows. Only the emperor and statues of gods could wear purple robes. Only augurs, aka the special emperor's seer, could wear saffron robes. Only married women could wear a stola, which was basically like a long toga. And only Roman citizens could wear a toga. But if you were a regular citizen, you could wear it when you got to voting age. This one confused me. I couldn't really understand, but it seems like the toga was more special clothing, and day to day you would just opt for a tunic. Then, the number of stripes you had on your tunic denoted your social rank, and if you had a gold trim on your tunic, that let the people around you know you did some big military stuff. Also, a guy named Emperor Honorius later added a law banning wearing barbarian split leg trousers. So, come on, bring back skirts for men, okay? Sumptuary laws existed in some extent for the next 1,000 years or so, with their final hurrah coming during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, aka during the Elizabethan period, and she ruled between 1558 and 1603. Under Ms. Liz's rule, sumptuary laws were extremely strictly regulated. So, although laws controlling consumption of materials based on class did exist since classical Rome and Greece, this was actually the last period in which sumptuary laws were harshly enforced. At this time, certain colors, trims, and fabrics were restricted to certain classes. But even this didn't stop trends from spreading to all realms of both income and standing. The popular fashion at the time was known for being a colorful one. Meanwhile, the silhouette for the majority of the period was very stiff, bell or cylinder shaped on the lower body, with an upside down V flattened chest shape on top. And the layers to create this shape tended to look pretty similar across the classes, give or take a few. So, to give you an idea of how trends manifested across the classes, I would like to do a quick speed run through those layers so you can get an idea of what it would be like to get dressed as a lady in the Elizabethan era. First off, we start with the smock, or shift, basically a simple linen undergarment that protects the outer clothes from the sweat and dirt of the human body. This would tend to be visible at the neck or sleeve cuffs, so those parts would be decorated with a bit of lace or embroidery, but generally it would be a simple white linen dress-ish thing. Next up, shapewear, aka the corset or pair of bodies as it was called at the time, which was basically a tight bodice stiffened with reed or whalebone. And while the bearskin corset tight lacing fantasy haunts us in our historical movie nightmares, corsets were not as extreme as you might think, more similar to a bra than, a waist trainer. First off, the corset would be necessary for courtwear and fancy occasions, but generally petticoat bodies would suffice, which were basically like a soft core bodice sewn to a petticoat skirt. This combination of smoothing the front upper body and narrowing the waist with voluminous skirts to create a huge contrast between the two allowed the person to achieve a fashionable silhouette sufficiently for housewear and casual, practical clothing. Someone with a bigger bust might not get away with this because they would need more support to achieve the fashionable shape, while a member of the itty bitty titty committee could get away with just some boning in their gown. Next up, the farthingale. This is the precursor to the crinoline, which is basically a cone-shaped hoop skirt that created the popular shape. Earlier in the period, ladies opted for the Spanish farthingale, which created an A-line shape, but later on, the wheeled farthingale rose in popularity, which is called a wheeled farthingale because it's literally like a wheel around your waist, almost like a tutu made out of structured corset-esque material. But not a regular floppy tutu, it's more stiff, like as if it was a tutu made out of cardboard. It essentially creates a flat circular shelf around your waist, which then the dress drapes over and creates the fashionable shape. But honestly, when we try to discuss the wheeled farthingale, we might as well be saying it was made out of cardboard, because we actually have no idea how they were made or what they even looked like. There are literally no extant garments remaining. Basically, all we know about these farthingales is the shape they made your dress, and some of the materials from the old tailor's bills. These bills list the classic pre-plastic time materials like whalebone, reeds, and wiring, starching to reinforce fabric, and buckram fabric, which seems to be some sort of quilted reinforced by being stuffed with scraps fabric. Now that we're done with the base shapewear, we can get with the padding. Next up is the sexy named bum roll, which is a variation of sausage-shaped pillow that you tie around your waist to make the contrast between your waist and the skirts more extreme. Sometimes it was made of two crescent moon-shaped pillows draped over each hip, but honestly, if it achieved the goal, it didn't much matter what it looked like. Next, we get into the fun and the frills. Petticoats! Layers and layers of flouncy skirts. These were essentially a mix between an under and overgarment in that they softened and enhanced the silhouette, but also were often intentionally shown through slits and bottoms of skirts, and the areas that would be visible were accordingly embellished with lace and trims. Different fabrics were used both as design choices, but also in order to adjust for the seasons as well. For example, a wool skirt in the winter. Next up comes the kirtle, which is a variation of skirts or an undergown that is A-line shaped and also intended to be partially visible. Then, if you want to get fancy, you might add a four-part, which is like a fancy apron that would be added for extra pizzazz, and usually would match the fabric of the gown or the sleeves. Finally, we get to the partlet. Now, this one is kind of hard to explain, so bear with me, or maybe just Google it, but basically, it's an optional thing. It's like a top neck area, almost bib, that covers the low neckline of the dress and adds more lace and frills to the outfit. Finally, it's gown time. The gown is not quite what we imagine when we think of a gown or dress today. There were many types that were popular during this period, so for one, I'm just going to describe the fashionable French gown. It is essentially like a low neckline vest with a skirt attached, but the skirt is open at the front so that you can see the stuff underneath. So it's more like a long vest coat that only is closed at the waist, if that makes sense. Then the matching or contrasting sleeves would be sewn or laced onto the gown. Okay, I'm not going to go too deep into footwear and accessories or we'll be here all day, but in short, hair would be covered with some sort of headgear, and shoes would be worn. When we talk about historical fashion, something we need to remember is that most of the time, if a garment was no longer wearable, it would be reused and turned into a new one to save the valuable material. This process continued over and over and over again, even for the rich, often being remade into smaller clothes for children or passed on to servants, who would then continue the process until finally the fabric would be used as rags or stuffing in the creation of materials like buckram. This is a big reason why we're limited on extant garments. Sadly, throughout much of history, clothing was not respected as a valuable element of history, the way other historical artifacts are. So often we are limited on these items and documentation as well. Everyone hopped on the anti-Kim train when the Met Gala Maryland dress fiasco happened, but sadly this is nothing new. The delicate nature of fabric also means that poor storage and handling can spell the demise of the few garments that do remain. Okay, let's get off of this somber train and get back to the topic at hand. Elizabethan silhouette. It certainly was not the most comfortable one, and if you were a working lady, it would be practically impossible to maintain during any sort of labor. Working women would wear a structured bodice just like upper classes, but generally, common people would have front-lacing bodices so that they could dress themselves and be able to loosen it for more comfortable movement as needed. Upper classes would generally have more elaborate bodices, which laced at the back. In order to achieve the desired bell-shaped skirt, women who could not afford layers of petticoats and costly farthingales, and also needed the ease of movement that layers of skirts would inhibit, opted instead for a different structure: bum rolls. These would contribute to the fashionable shape, but also create more space for leg movement by pushing the skirt out and away from the legs. Long skirts are also risky business when it comes to walking outdoors and laboring. Don't forget that sidewalks didn't really become a common thing until the 1700s. So imagine sharing the street with carriages, horseback riders, and jostling people all trying to get somewhere. Basically, if you had to walk anywhere via common streets, you were at risk of getting your skirt caught. So across the board, both middle and lower class women would have slightly shorter skirts, often with double hems to make cleaning and repair easier in order to extend the life of the garment. Unfortunately, all the changes to the structure under the garment made it obvious your social status on the outside. If you saw two identical women walking down the street with dresses of the same exact materials, but one was dressed in a front-laced bodice with a rounded curved top to her shortened bell-shaped skirt, you would know instantly who belonged to which class. Now that we've talked a bit about the shape, let's take a look at materials. As a general rule, Elizabethan clothing was mainly wool and linen, with linen undergarments and wool overlays for warmth. And although these materials were shared across the classes, things like silk, satin, velvet, damask, and taffeta were reserved only for the elite. But materials and fashions were not the only separation either. Throughout the 1600s, the European aristocracy popularized the color black. It actually originally came from the Spanish courts, but Protestant England quickly picked up the trend as it really suited the stricter constraints of that religious period. Meanwhile, reds, yellows, and blues were cheap and easy to dye, which is why modern Renaissance fairs are so full of these bright colors. Common people who were unable to wear fancy silks or floaty taffetas opted instead for bright colors to express themselves and their styles. Now, this is not to say that all lower class people wore bright colors. The key thing with easy and cheap to dye colors is that they often fade just as easily. Similarly, undyed clothes would remain in their natural, neutral tones and had a faded color palette as well. Essentially, the more expensive the color, the darker and more richly dyed and long-lasting conveyed wealth. Meanwhile, gaudily bright colors, which often faded quickly, revealed themselves as cheap. In historical fiction movies, we often see that everything was gray, brown, beige, and while this may be accurate for some, it was certainly not the norm. Across the world, there's a rich history of natural dyes, and at the end of the day, the poor are no different from the rich. We all have the capacity to desire expression through clothing. A more accurate picture of the Renaissance period will show you a wide palette of colors with both bright and muted tones well represented. Although colors may fade, the preciousness of fabric would mean that the item would be re-dyed and repaired as much as possible. Despite these differences, the general trends did remain consistent across the classes. And as we discuss the extreme ends of the wealth spectrum, we have to remember that even during this time there existed a healthy middle-class population. Here, though, the differences became more subtle, but disparities are more clockable on the accessories and accoutrements. More lace, which literally every stitch is hand-sewn, precious metal thread, beads, and simply a bigger wardrobe were telltale signs of wealth. Ruffs were another popular element that required a large amount of fabric, an immense amount of care and starching to create the fashionable shape. So, the bigger the ruff, the bigger the pockets, am I right? At the same time, affordability and things like sumptuary laws were not the only things that kept the classes separated through clothing. This separation continues into later centuries even as wealth disparity decreases and industrialization begins. let's jump a bit further ahead into industrialization, to the Victorian period. This period began in the mid-19th century and lasted just over 50 years. Fashion-wise, it can be subdivided into the crinoline period from 1850 to 1859, then the first and second bustle periods between 1870 and 1890, and then the turn of the century from 1890 to 1900. An incredible amount of changes were happening in the Victorian era. From Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, starting the first World Fair exhibition, to the arrival of newfangled inventions like photography. Synthetic dyes were also beginning to come into use, which revolutionized the textiles industry. It was also the rebirth of couture and France's re-takeover of the fashion stage once again. At the beginning of the period, another revolutionary item emerged in fashion: the sewing machine. This supported the rise of garment factories as the American Civil War and general industrialization called for better and easier ways to dress people. The sewing machine also found its way into many homes, which allowed women to begin to take their look into their own hands and convert their old-fashioned clothes into fresh new styles. So much happened in this period that it deserves its own episode in the future, so for now let's focus on the key player I wanted to talk about. The one which gave the early Victorian period its name, the crinoline. The crinoline was a new invention of the 1850s, a modernization of the whalebone hoop skirt from the 18th century. This allowed for a light, easy undergarment that gave you the fashionable shape without requiring layers and layers of skirts. The former stiff bodices evolved into shorter, corset styles, which were called stays. These were loosely laced and allowed freedom of movement. So this coupled with the crinoline to create the fashionable shape with much less restrictions, so working women were able to present themselves as fashionable and polished, while still being able to go about their daily work with ease. The home sewing machine further allowed women to add more embellishments and self-made trims. In terms of silhouette, from the 1850s to 60s, the skirt shifted from a bell shape to more of an oval skirt, and eventually towards that flat front with the large back. There are some iconic photos of traveling salesmen selling crinolines from the backs of carts and in market stalls, with ladies rushing to buy them. I'll be posting some of these fun photos on the Instagram at readthecaretag, so check it out if you want to see what those look like. The nifty solutions of this period, as well as the social mobility that was beginning to allow people of lower classes to access opportunities, happened in tandem with the desired fashions becoming more achievable in cheaper ways. We all know the saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, must be a duck, right? In the same vein, if you could dress yourself to blend into higher circles, you had access to marital, business, and social connections to improve your standing. I love getting into the nitty-gritty of the silhouettes and elements of each period dress, but I feel like I should reel myself in. There is so much more than I could tell in just one broad introductory episode, so I will leave the details for more specific episodes in the future. This is also not a solely historical podcast, but overall, I wanted to highlight that throughout time, humans have chosen to dress the way they dress in order to convey who they are and who they want to be. The way we dress dictates the sort of society we are accepted into, and this is no less true today. Everything we wear sends a message, and we choose to wear these things in order to attract particular kinds of people to ourselves, both romantically, socially, and professionally. Even the choice to not engage with fashion sends a particular message. Someone wearing all black with punk hair and makeup certainly won't be confused for someone going to a funeral. In the same vein, the rich widow wrapped in furs won't be confused for the nouveau riche wearing a Versace tracksuit, despite being in the same tax bracket. I'm not trying to be shady there. I just want to illustrate how much what we wear affects how people view us and how we view each other. To be completely honest, when I walk down the street, I judge the looks around me. Not in a mean way, just simply trying to gauge what sort of person I'm looking at. This is a normal human behavior that has evolved for us to gauge whether others are a threat and how they might figure into our lives. For example, let me set the scene for you. I'm out on the town. I've become separated from my friends, and my phone, it's dead. I need someone to let me use their phone so I can check the metro schedule, or call an Uber or a taxi or something like that. I see a fashion girly walk by, dripping in bangles, safety pins holding her skirt together, and some tabby boots on her feet. I also see another girl walk by, rocking the Kendall Haley model off duty look. Who do you think I'm going to ask to help me? I think the answer is clear. Now, the question is why, right? Why would I prefer to ask the tabby baddie for help? Not because either is a better person or anything like that. Plenty of my best friends sport that denim, white top, white sneaker combo proudly and look amazing doing so. I think they have a great sense of style and are just as cool as my fashion girly friends. But why would I approach one or the other? Because on face value, I see someone who is much more likely to have similar interests to me, to see me as similar to them, and therefore be more open to helping me. Okay, now let's take away the context of my scary evening. I see the same girlies at a coffee shop sitting near me, and I'm feeling like chatting, feeling like striking up a convo. Why would I talk to one or the other? Well, the fashion girly might work in the same field as me. They might be connected in ways that would be useful for both of us to know each other and maybe work together in the future. We present ourselves as part of the same community. Just as followers of punk trends would identify each other in the 80s, we continue to do the same. Sometimes our judgments are right, and sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes we are perceived in ways that we didn't intend or wish. But nonetheless, every single one of us continues to get up and choose how to play dress up every single day. My name is Maya. Thank you so much for joining me, and don't forget to always read the care tag. Until next time, ciao!